When and how will the Ukraine war end? Analysis and prediction. I believe the best way to answer the question of when and how the Ukraine war will end is via a timeline. Rough timelines that I've put together in preparation for this video to show step by step what I believe will happen. I've included high margins of error and I've made rather rough estimates because firstly, with any geopolitical or military situation, it is very hard to predict things specifically. However, it can be quite easy to predict things in a range of time, or as long as you do a rough wide estimate, certain things can be concluded. And even a layman like me can draw certain conclusions quite concretely, as long as you don't try and be too specific. So I'm going to show a timeline, month by month, of what I think will happen. And this will show the situation as I see it in a good way, because everyone will be able to see why one thing leads to another. So let's get started with it. I started writing this video on the 22nd of January. I know we're quite far past that now, but I'm going to do this as if we are on the 22nd of January. So, what's next for the rest of this month, January? So I believe that the next big thing in sort of the schedule for the war is the capture of the town of Bakhmut. Now, you may have heard about this a bit in the news. Bakhmut is a large town in eastern Ukraine. It's in the region of Donetsk, and it's got a pre-war population of around 70,000 people. It's quite a large town. Not much tactically or strategically there, but it is seen as a symbolic victory. If Russia can capture this town within the next sort of few weeks without having to mobilize more troops. Now that's because it is sort of the last step in eastern Ukraine before you get to the last cities in Donetsk. And obviously Russia's primary goal in this war is those two eastern regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. So it's a big symbolic victory for Russia if they can capture this town. And unfortunately, I believe that they will capture this town in the near future, in this month, February. Next month, February. And I believe this will happen before the 15th, or maybe it will take up until the 20th of this month before it's encircled. That's the encirclement, by the way, not the capture of the town. Because something that analysts have learned in the course of this war is that the Ukrainian army is very good at dealing with the conditions of encirclement. Because we saw earlier in the war, if anyone remembers, the city of Mariupol. You may have heard about that on the news. It was a relatively large city, probably like a medium-sized city in southern Ukraine. They got encircled very early on in the war. It got encircled in, I believe, late March. Let me have a look here. And Mariupol lasted 2 months and 3 weeks under a Russian encirclement before the last remnants of the military station there finally gave in. So with Ukrainian morale being as it is, and sort of the hardiness and the toughness of the Ukrainian army being how it is, I'm not even going to attempt to predict when Bakhmut will actually be completely under Russian control. I'm just going to predict that it's going to be encircled. They will definitely, I'm putting my foot down here, the Russian army, I believe, will definitely have encircled Bakhmut in this month, so in February. And the reason I believe that is because of a projection of the current progress they're making. You can track the progress of each army these days with some very, very useful websites. For want of a better word, because of the grim subject matter, but one website I use is called Deep State Map. A bit of a weird name, but it is a website that takes hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of reports from either social media, local media reports, and it also takes into account Ukrainian and Russian state reports of all battles, all different conflicts, all different skirmishes, to create a precise, specific map of where troops are and where the front line is in this war. There's another website called live.ua map, and that's a more general thing. They track conflicts all over the world. They've done this sort of thing for a few years now. They did it with the Taliban taking back Iraq when US forces left. So they've got a lot of experience doing this, and both these websites can give you, and have given me, very specific information about where the front lines are. But again, everything's just an estimate. So at present, Russia is gaining ground and slowly crawling forward, anywhere between a few hundred feet and a quarter of a mile a day. Basically always less than a mile a day. They very rarely at this point in the war are gaining more than a mile a day. And I believe more specifically it's about 0.15 miles a day. That's a calculation I've made based on the maps I've seen and the progress that the Russian army has made in the past 2 weeks. I took a daily average of how much ground they're gaining a day in terms of the encirclement area, and I took the distance from one side of the encirclement on the south and the other side on the north, and that was about 8 miles. So that means that each side, each front on the north and on the south needs to travel 4 miles to close the ring and encircle the town. So if that's in 0.15 miles a day and they need to travel 4 miles, I'll do that calculation for you live right now. Okay, that is 27 days from now. It makes you think, well, I mean, it's only 28 days in February, so 27 days from, in actuality, I'm posting this on the 5th of February, but 27 days from the 5th, that's in March, that's not in February. But the things about encirclements is they accelerate once the major logistical points are cut off and you are generally around the back of the enemy as well as the front, and you can shell them and attack them with missiles from all sides. The encirclement almost always accelerates in the later stages, and in fact in the past few days I've been seeing it accelerate a little bit more. They've been taking up to a quarter of a mile a day in the past couple of days. So it's already accelerating. So that's why I believe relatively confidently, maybe like 80% sure, that the town of Bakhmut will be encircled this month. However, this won't be the last that you hear of Bakhmut. We'll be back to it soon. The next big event that's sort of on the calendar, something that I know is going to happen for definite, is the updating of the price cap that the G7 and the EU are placing on Russian hydrocarbons and oil. On December 5th last year, the G7 and the EU placed a price cap on oil from Russia. And that means that they can only sell it below a certain price. And it's kind of up to the government to say whether, okay, so are we going to boycott those countries that impose the price cap and lose all that money and all that custom, or are we going to abide by the price cap? So obviously, because hydrocarbon exports make up about half of Russia's GDP, you heard that right, about half of all the money that flows into Russia and all of their gross domestic product comes from hydrocarbon sales. So obviously, Russia was not going to cut off the G7 and the entire EU from their oil. So they were forced to sell below, the price cap was $60 per barrel. For a bit of reference, at its peak in summer, they were selling it for about $90 per barrel. And the reason that they did that was because of the market forces and how they actually helped the Russian government last year. And the West kind of made a bit of a blunder last year by indirectly helping Russia fund the war. Because what happened was, in February and in March, as soon as this full-scale invasion started, an awful lot of Western countries placed import sanctions on Russia so they wouldn't sell them any goods. A lot of these were electronics and other sophisticated machinery that Russia doesn't produce itself. And, this had pretty bad effect on the Russian economy in the short term. The ruble collapsed, it became almost worthless. But that was only for a few days, and, things looked like they're going to go very bad for Russia last year. So what happened? Well, it turns out, in the shock of this wave of sanctions and sort of the panic that governments were going through about the state of the economy in the future, they were thinking about what they're going to do in winter. Because obviously a large proportion of hydrocarbons, specifically oil, comes from Russia, which European countries need in winter. So, with Russian relations at an all-time low, and the possibility of Russia cutting off the supply to some countries, there was a bit of a rush on Russian oil, a bit of a wordplay there, but there was a bit of a panic buy of Russian oil in the summer because, these deals, these contracts to get oil from other countries are done months and months in advance, sometimes years in advance. So for that winter, last winter, 2022, those deals needed to be done and those contracts needed to be purchased in the summer. So at the height of the war last year, when the weather was right and when there was a lot of large-scale fighting going on still, in June and July, Russian oil revenues actually increased. Despite the sanctions, the amount of profit that the Russian government made, so their sort of like government current account, the amount of money they had left over was a record-breaking surplus. So how you hear about deficits, a lot of countries are in a deficit. Russia recently, in the past few years, has actually been running a budget surplus. They've had money left over, have money to spare. Up from January to November, if you just took those months, and you didn't have December, that would have been the largest budget surplus Russia ever recorded. So, they kind of messed up that one. And a pretty specific instance of that was the strengthening of the Russian ruble. So the thing is, the strength of the currency is kind of, just relative compared to other currencies. It just means, so if you wanted to buy something from a foreign country, how much of something, whatever it is, could you buy with your currency? And the thing is, when a country increases its proportion of exports, compared to imports, which happened to Russia, because they started selling a lot more oil to the countries that were sanctioning it, had just introduced sanctions on it a few months before. It was selling a lot more oil and gas, and it wasn't getting any imports. So because of, ways that I don't entirely understand and also aren't that important, so I'm not going to spend time researching them, this led to a big strengthening of the Russian ruble, which meant that 1 ruble was worth, more pounds per ruble. And this has, all this economic stuff sounds very abstract, but this actually has a very real, very visible, very direct effect that you can see. One big The example I always go to, this is a very easy example, is in the autumn and also in the early winter, Russia started purchasing large amounts of Iranian kamikaze drones for the war. Hundreds and hundreds of them, potentially, I think over 1,000 now. These are cheaply made drones with a small explosive payload that you can just crash into a building or whatever, and it will just set off a small explosion. It's just a cheap, messy way to cause trouble, and lots of people have died from these drones. And you can see directly how the way the West managed this war in the early stages caused more death. Because if you just look at a graph of the ruble in July, when most of these drones were purchased, if the ruble was, I believe it was 140% more valuable than it was in February. So, if they're buying from a foreign country, i.e. Iran, 1 Russian ruble will be worth 140% more Iranian whatevers. I don't know what currency Iran use. But that means that Russia can buy 140% more drones to kill people. So you can see it. It's not just like this abstract ethereal thing, which is the problem with economics. It's hard to get people to care about economics or to understand it because you can't see the direct effects. But with something like that, where you can directly see that Russia was basically allowed and empowered actively to buy more than double the foreign military equipment from Iran because of the Western rush on oil straight after they sanctioned them. So that was a very bad move, but it's being rectified as we speak. On December 5th, they placed that price cap, that $60 price cap, and Russian oil revenues went down drastically. Drastically. Do you remember when I said that if you just took from January to November, the Russian budget surplus would be record-breaking? That's because in December, they ran a gigantic deficit, which took out the majority of the surplus that year. So, as of the start of December, Russia's total budget surplus over, its whole history was 62 billion, the equivalent of 62 billion pounds, which is quite a bit. And 56 billion of those pounds were made from January to November 2020. The vast majority of Russian government surplus was made in the first 11 months of last year, which is mental. Then, in December, they ran a budget deficit of minus 47 billion, leaving a 15 billion surplus, which isn't record-breaking at all. And that's because not only was Russia restricted in selling to the G7 and to the EU, and there's no way of them cutting off the oil, because the amount of Russian jobs that rely on oil, I believe it's around 8 million. I've written it down somewhere here, we'll see it later, but genuinely millions and millions of jobs in Russia rely on hydrocarbons and oil. I think it's more than 10 million actually, we'll see it later. There's no way they were going to cut that off. And another interesting thing is that maybe you think, okay, so maybe they'll ask for more purchases or a higher price from China, strong ally, or India, a moderately strong ally. But because Western countries, largely the US and also the UK sometimes, and the EU, have control of insurance for ships. Now, try and stay with me here. A lot of Western companies are in charge of insuring freighters and, tankers and these large ships that ship millions of liters of whatever around the world every day. These amazing big ships. They need insurance because, it's a big fucking investment. If one of those ships crashes and you're not insured, you're done for. So they need insurance. And because they're controlled by Western companies, you probably guessed what I'm going to say, those companies have been banned from supplying insurance to any ship, no matter what country it's from. So, unless or until China and India and Russia can set up their own insurance companies and get the money and the plans and just the entire red tape and logistics and the mind fuckery to make massive insurance projects to insure billions and billions of dollars of product so that they can start shipping above the price cap with insurance, then it'll be too late. That'll take years to make all that infrastructure. That'll just take years. So for now, even if China and India wanted to pay above the price cap, which to be honest they might not, even if they wanted to trade above the price cap, they can't get the insurance to do it. So basically, this is a global price cap. By forcing China and India's hand, the West has excluded Russia from basically every major world market, which is a pretty good job, that's pretty powerful. So the West are definitely making up for their earlier bad handling of this war by basically kneecapping Russia's monetary abilities. I mean, and I'm serious. Look at this graph. Look at how much was undone just in 1 month. It's crazy. And so the plan with this price cap is to review it every 2 months. And every 2 months, they'll ask the question, are we going to reduce this cap? And they're going to reduce it in $5 increments. Probably, I guess they can reduce it in more than $5 increments, but that's the plan, to go $5 by $5. And so on February 5th, today, they're going to meet. They might be meeting right now, quite exciting. They're going to meet, and they're going to say, okay, are we going to keep it at 60, or are we going to move it down to 55? Which would make it, the lowest it's been in decades, sustained. And that will obviously take out several percentage points of Russia's entire economy. Because remember, it takes up half of their economy. Half. So even if they reduce it by $5 a barrel, what's that? Okay, sorry, I'm improvising now. I'm going off script. I'm doing calculations on the fly. Oh, I'm crazy. Stop me. But it is just mental, because Russia is it's almost like a fake country. It's not really a proper country. It's just a fucking oil well. It's an oil well with houses built on it. $5 is 8% of $60, which means that would be a blow of about 4% of Russia's entire GDP and, their entire economic power in one fell swoop. They've just decided, they probably will just decide to wipe out several percentage points of Russia's monetary power and Russia's revenue. And this is unprecedented. This is the first time something like this has happened. This is the first time there has been an attempt to sanction a major country's hydrocarbons. It's never been done before. It's always been thought of as too risky, or what if they just cut us off? But I guess in this situation specifically, Russia doesn't have the capacity to cut off these markets because they need the money. They need the money to fund the war. So they have to abide by the price cap. They have to. But yeah, this has never been done before. No other country has been sanctioned this cohesively by this many other countries when they are a major player in the oil market. They've always just been able to bully people. Kind of think of countries with a lot of oil. Saudi Arabia I believe that has a lot of oil. But yeah, basically, a lot of the OPEC countries, the OPEC is basically groups of countries that have a lot of oil and natural hydrocarbons. OPEC is basically a mob. These countries have thought that they can do whatever they want, and the West is going to be too scared to sanction them because of what they have, the natural resources they have. But this is a big step forward, because this is saying that, no, we're not going to be bullied by these oil-rich countries, these oil barons, these dickheads, we're going to make a stand and get together and, fuck up your profits. Which, it's great, and it's doing a good job. It is taking massive amounts of money away from Russia. And the thing is, I am forecasting that this year, they will get into a deficit, a very large deficit, which they're not going to be able to fill while this war's going on. The books just don't balance. So Russian hydrocarbon revenues and, sort of general revenues for the whole country have not been published yet for January, but I predict that the deficit will be bigger than it was in December. That's because this time they're including all of the hydrocarbons. I've used that word a lot today. In the price cap, it was just oil, but now it's other hydrocarbons like gas, kerosene. That's a hydrocarbon. Anything that comes from crude oil is a hydrocarbon. There's a lot more products that come from crude oil than you might be aware of. Some types of plastic do, and there's plenty of oils and lubricants used in industrial and manufacturing capacities that come from crude oil. So it's not just actual usable refined oil, it's a whole range of products that are being capped. So that's a massive percentage of the Russian economy that's just being handicapped. So I believe that the deficit will be higher this month. However, estimation is an art. And in order not to embarrass myself, if my predictions turn out to be wrong, I'm going to be very charitable in my estimations, and I'm going to assume that the deficit will remain the same every month. So that deficit of 47 billion pounds, I'm going to just act as if in January, February, March going forward, that deficit stays the same. Just so I don't get ahead of myself and end up making some mad prediction about, oh, we're fucking in 6 months, the fucking Russian government's gonna be in £1 trillion of debt and they're just Russia won't exist anymore. I'm not gonna, do anything like that. I'm gonna try and keep it cautious. I'm gonna try and keep my predictions cautious and realistic. So let's take a more specific look at Russia's finances. Aside from its general budget surplus, Russia has a very impressive reserve of foreign exchange. Now, what foreign exchange is it's a whole network of different things. It's kind of an umbrella term for any sort of economic asset that is based or stored in a foreign country. Now, what countries will do, all countries do this, they will invest in bonds, gilts, shares, they'll just put cash into foreign bank accounts, they'll entrust it with government companies, certain personnel in government, loads of different bank accounts, loads of different investment funds, loads of different hedge funds, pension pots, any sort of economic device you can think of. Countries will sort of hedge their bets by keeping money tucked away somewhere all around the world in all different countries, obviously including their own. And Russia has hundreds and hundreds of billions of pounds in foreign exchange tucked away across the world. Fourth largest in the world, in fact. And in 2021, these exchange reserves were estimated to be £442.94 billion. So that's a pretty big piggy bank for them to keep fighting the war with. However, it's estimated that as of January 2023, half of these reserves have been spent. So that's £221.47 billion left as of late January now. If you add on to that, that was as of December. And if you add on to that the budget surplus, which Russia had up until the end of December, that's 62 billion, the total sort of stockpile of Russian money that Russia's basically starting off with this year, the start of January, that wad of cash that they've got to spend on the war totals to £283 billion. So the West already has a bit of a head start economically because, as I said, in December, there was that big wiping out of 47 billion. So if you take 47 billion off that, that's 236 billion as of the end of December. As of the end of January, again, if we're taking it as the same amount, that's 189 billion left as of the end of January. And at the end of February, it'll be 142 billion pounds left in the government's kitty. Another big event that should be taking place this month, and very soon in fact, is the second partial mobilization of the Russian military. Now, what a mobilization is, it's when large numbers of men are conscripted into the army and industry is changed. Instead of catering to domestic demands, instead to military demands. So factories, instead of making whatever, they were going to make cars, start to make armor for tanks. It is the mobilization of the whole country to serve a war. And there was a partial mobilization in September of 320,000, roughly, troops, which have given Russia a lot more manpower in this war. But it's not enough. Right now, it's not enough. Putin was hedging his bets that that'll be enough, and in winter he'd have enough time to make Ukraine surrender. You may have heard around Christmas time, pretty tragic news about Russian missile strikes taking out electric plants and taking out all the infrastructure required to put electricity and gas and heating into people's homes in a pretty fucking cold Ukrainian winter. And Russia was trying to rely on the fact that they would surrender or just freeze to death, and the Russian populace and therefore the economy and their military supplies would just collapse in the winter and in the cold, and that they'd be able to freeze them out, which is a pretty brutal way of doing it, but it didn't work. So now Russia basically needs more men, and that's not good news for Putin, because mobilization and conscription is not popular in Russia. It's not at all. But there are clues that he's going to do it anyway. One of these clues is a recent law that was quietly changed around, I believe, the 20th of January, which overturned the previous exemption for men who were fathers of 3 or more children from being conscripted into the military, which is, lovely news. Now men who are fathers of 3 or more can be conscripted in the military, presumably to go die in Ukraine. There was also around, just before the 20th, a Russian politician, can't remember the name, went around to different factories all throughout the country and asked the factory managers to put up lists of men that they can spare and which men they can't spare economically to keep their factory running. So that's nice. They want to be on that list, unless it's the one to be exempted. And oh yes, there was a video that surfaced a little bit later on, that was around the 23rd of January, that showed Putin on a little publicity stunt going to visit a factory, and these workers in this factory looked rather nervous, and he was captured saying on video, maybe he meant it in sort of a dark humour way, and maybe he just had a bit of dry wit, but he did say to them, don't worry, you'll be exempt from any mobilisation. Which is a fucking mental thing just to say to some random factory workers on video. But yeah, there are several clues that hint that Russia is going to announce a second mobilization very soon. Probably, well, almost definitely of around 500,000 men. But how do I know this is going to happen that soon? How soon is soon? When specifically is it going to happen? Well, in order to work out when specifically, we need to know how many people have died, been injured, or captured or defected in the Russian army. And on top of that, we need to know the minimum amount of soldiers that need to be in Ukraine to prevent a total collapse of the Russian presence there. Once we've got those two figures, then we can see how long it will take and what time estimated that Russia will absolutely need to get more soldiers, otherwise the military presence is going to collapse. So if you take the total estimate of troops that have been sent to Ukraine so far, take the initial 170,000 that were sent to try and overtake the country in February, plus an extra 25,000, that's the maximum number of soldiers brought in from foreign legions. Russia has quite a military presence of foreign Syrian citizens and Afghani citizens from, it's a whole historical thing. They tried to invade Afghanistan in the 80s, I believe, and they've still got Afghani nationals and Syrian nationals and, loads of other people in the Middle East all around there that actually support Russia genuinely, and they want to further Russian aims in their country. It's a whole very interesting cultural thing. But yeah, about up to 25,000 foreign legionaries were taken into Ukraine initially to replenish Russian losses before they wanted to use any other Russians. They just, let's throw the brown people at them. On top of that, there is the up to 320,000 who were drafted into the military on that partial mobilization in September. Probably around 300,000, but Vladimir Putin claimed 320,000. So I'll take that as the maximum amount that there could be, because he's a fucking liar. And then the maximum amount of private soldiers from Russia that fought in the war was around 60,000. Russia has been using more and more private military companies recently. One of them that you may have seen in the news is called the Wagner Group. Now, the advantage of using private military companies is there's more plausible deniability for war crimes. So if the Wagner Group, kills 100 citizens in a town in eastern Ukraine, then Russia will get less backlash from that because they're not officially, proper professional Russian soldiers. They're, just some guys we hired. Also, a lot of these private military companies are quite brutal. So if they just want a quick, easy sort of human shield to just throw some men at the situation, they can do that with private military companies. One thing that the Wagner Group is well known for is using prison conscripts, unpaid prison conscripts, mostly unpaid, where the head of the Wagner Group will go to prisons and say, listen, I can give you your freedom if you fight for us, and in 6 months' time, you're still alive, then you're free, and you can go, you can stay if you want, and we'll pay you, or you can go. So that's the risk. You come with us for a few months, risk death, but if you do survive, then you're a free man, and you've got a job with us if you want it, or you can just leave. So they have a pretty large, considering obviously Russia has one of the highest prison populations in the world, of over 400,000 before the war, probably a lot less now. Considering Russia has a significant prison population, which they'd probably like to get rid of one way or another, to be honest, because of, they're not particularly nice to their prisoners. They probably see them as degenerates. They wouldn't mind if they died. If the Russian government uses the Wagner Group, they get a cheap, easy source of soldiers that they don't care about, because they're not giving anything to the economy, really, are they? They're prisoners. They're not doing much. They probably haven't got jobs. So that's why in these desperate times, Russia is relying more and more on the Wagner Group. So you're adding that 60,000 and the total comes to 575,000. That's a high estimate for the total number of troops that have been sent to Ukraine from Russia so far. For a lower estimate, you take the lower guess for the foreign legionaries, which is 15,000. The lower guess for the number of soldiers in the partial mobilization, which is 300,000, not 320 that Vladimir Putin claimed. And the lower estimate for the amount of private military men in the war, which is 40,000. And that comes to 525,000. That's a 50,000 difference. So we're working in quite a big range here, so I'm less likely to get it wrong. But that is a pretty, I'd say a relatively accurate estimate of the total number of soldiers. So, as I say, if we take that initial 170,000 as the, minimum benchmark for what Russia need to have in Ukraine at any one time to prevent a total collapse of their presence, then that means that 355 to 405,000 men can be injured. That's the maximum until things start to break down. Now, how are we going to calculate how many people have been injured? Well, there's a very nifty historical way to do that. From a lot of studying of history, analysts over the decades have realized that generally, as a general rule of thumb, the ratio of injured soldiers to dead soldiers has been 3-1. Now, this has changed in recent years in the most developed countries. For example, in the US Army, in a lot of conflicts like Syria and Afghanistan, I think it was Afghanistan specifically. In Afghanistan specifically, the ratio of injured soldiers to dead soldiers was over 10-1, approaching 15-1. And that's as medical care in the field improves and as soldiers become safer in a war. In the Afghanistan example specifically, the Taliban were far less equipped and organized than the American army. So there was a massive discrepancy, and sometimes in situations like that, it can be much higher than 3-1, but the very general, broad, historical average has been 3-1. And as we know, the Russian army is not very well equipped, and nor do they really value the lives of their soldiers. That's not just a random, slate that I'm saying. It's not just a fucking roast. This is actual official Russian military doctrine, that they don't care about their soldiers, that they will just throw men at a problem and intentionally get millions of their soldiers killed and injured in order to achieve an objective. This has been Russian military doctrine since Stalingrad, where the Russian military realized that because of Russia's massive population at the time compared to Nazi Germany, they could just throw over 1 million men into the city of Stalingrad to protect it from the Nazis. And, they made massive losses. They lost a lot more men than the Nazis, but they repelled them from the city. And Stalingrad is seen as a turning point for Russia in World War II, because after that they had a string of military victories because they changed the momentum and started pushing the Nazis back. Stalingrad was where the Nazis were stopped, and since then it has been Russian military doctrine to use its large population to its advantage by throwing men at a situation. So you can use that 3-to-1 ratio as a pretty good calculation for Russia. So, if you take 60,000 dead soldiers, tragically, as a low estimate, and 70,000 as a high estimate, again, you'll probably find estimates that are very different to this. Ukraine saying that they've killed 100,000 Russian soldiers. That's not true. There's no way that's true. And I think they were claiming that in autumn, so now it would be much over 100,000. There's no mathematical way that makes sense. That's just propaganda. Ukraine is not innocent of propagandizing in this war. It's not just Russia. But obviously, I understand why Ukraine propagandizes about the figures a little bit. I understand it. I'm not insulting them. I'm just saying that it is propaganda. You'll also find much lower estimates than what I'm saying from, like the Red Cross or the UN. You may have seen that, only 10,000 have been killed confirmed. But that's the thing is about those estimates. They only work off the absolutely individually confirmed kills. And they will be slowly, bureaucratically working through that for years. They will spend years painstakingly recording almost every single death. So you can't use those figures as an actual accurate estimate. So it's between 60 and 70,000, the amount of people who've died. So to be charitable, and again, estimating is an art. You have to know how to estimate and how wide to make your parameters. There is the possibility that Russian conditions in the army are slightly better than people might think, and maybe the proportion of injured soldiers to dead soldiers is 4-to-1. So as a low estimate of the number injured, you take 60 and you times it by 4. So you get that 3-to-1. So you get triple, and then add on another one, that's times 4. So 60 times 4 would make 240,000 injured soldiers. 70,000 times 5, so that's if 70,000 Russian soldiers have died, and the ratio is 4-to-1, so 70,000 times 5 is 350,000. So here we've got a broad, but probably quite accurate estimate of the total injured soldiers so far. So if we take a look at our limit, then that means in the worst case scenario, the Russian military is already reaching the limit of the amount of soldiers they can lose before mobilizing. And take into account that mobilizing takes time. In the best case, they're about 2/3 of the way of reaching the limit before even a layman could conclude that they need reinforcements. So when I say soon, what specifically does soon mean? So obviously we know that it's going to be sometime in February, otherwise the Russian military will just start to collapse. They have to mobilize sometime in February, but can we get any more specific than that? If you fuse that mathematical prediction and the mathematical factor with news of Russia's ambition for a spring offensive, and if you take the 4-week minimum to draft these soldiers and to give them some basic training. It's not very good training, but some basic Russian training, and equip them and put them into battalions and then send them out. The 4-week minimum to get a significant number of soldiers onto the field. So if Russia want to attack on the 31st of March, they need to, the absolute latest, if they didn't lose any more soldiers in the meantime, until the 3rd, announced the conscription and the mobilization on the 3rd of March. So that's the absolute latest if, no other soldiers died in Russia. But we can narrow it down more than that. Because until that mobilization is announced, and also for those weeks before those new soldiers come in, all that time Russia will be relatively slowly, but albeit losing soldiers. Considering that 60 to 70,000 figure is based on late January, if Russia is going to wait 2 months before significant reinforcements arrive on the field, that means that they will have to endure another estimated 22 to 32,500 injuries. That's based off, in 11 months, 60 to 70,000 people dying, so 5.5 to 6.5 people being killed every month, which in turn means 22 to 32.5 people injured in 1 month. Sorry, that was 1 month. So, in those 2 months that they'd be waiting for the mobilization, there will be an additional 45 to 65,000 men injured, which would bring the total up to 285, all the way maybe to 415,000 injuries. So, it's a wide estimate, but whatever the specific figure is, it shows that Russia needs to mobilize quick, as soon as possible. Even if you take the lowest estimate of 285,000, that's still pretty close to the limit of injured men that Russia can endure. And obviously, if you take the 415,000 to be true, they'd be in a lot of trouble. So, my estimate is that Russia will probably announce a new mobilization before the 10th of February or on the 10th. And almost definitely, 95% sure that they will announce it on or before the 15th of February. They also need to prevent themselves being outpaced by a Ukrainian counteroffensive, because both sides are going to be looking to make offensives in the spring. So obviously it'd be ideal if Russia could get in there first and, do their counterattack first. Which means they'd like to be mobilized by early March, which means they need to announce it by early February. So, the general outlook for February is that the Russian economy will keep weakening. The Russian military will conscript more soldiers and announce a mobilization of probably 500,000 men. Bakhmut will be encircled, but it won't be fully actually captured in February. The 2022 surplus has almost been wiped out, and Russia is switching away from its attempt to use the winter to weaken the Ukrainian economy, people and military, especially as we have seen a relatively warm winter this year in Ukraine of about 5 to 10 degrees warmer than average, which is a lot. Moving on to March then, this is when Ukraine will start to get the big toys. And by that I mean the large equipment, armoured vehicles and tanks that the West has pledged for them. Now I'm going to take a little bit of a break from the month-by-month timeline structure of this video to instead look at when various important bits of equipment are going to be arriving in Ukraine. I'm making this diversion because probably the most important factor in how well Ukraine is going to do in this conflict and whether they're going to win or not and how soon they're going to win, the biggest factor is Western supplies. They have been making a killing, literally, with high-tech, sophisticated, expensive Western equipment that Russia just can't even compare to. So let's have a look at when various things that have been pledged will arrive. These timelines vary, but again, I'm going to sacrifice precision to get higher accuracy. I don't want to make a wrong prediction, so I'm just going to make rather wide predictions as to when. The Leopards will start appearing in March. These are Leopard 2 tanks that have been pledged by a variety of countries all across Europe. This is because Germany has recently lifted an export ban on these tanks. Germany makes these rather high-tech, very nifty Leopard 2 tanks, and they've been exported all across Europe. It's the most popular type of tank in Europe. But the thing is, Germany has a stipulation in their contracts, which means that the countries they sell to aren't allowed to donate or sell them to any other countries without explicit permission from Germany. And there are about 2,000 of these tanks all over Europe, and up to 200 of them have been pledged to Ukraine. But a big worry recently, in January, up until about the 20th of January, was that Germany might not want to lift the export ban. That's because they'd be scared of escalation. And, Germany's history, kind of starting 2 world wars, it's more complicated than that. They didn't just start it. Well, they started the second one. But, it's a whole thing. Germany's history, they don't want to be risking starting another war. So, understandably, they were very nervous about that, but that export ban has recently been lifted. So these Leopards, they'll start appearing on the battlefield relatively soon in Ukraine. Why is that? That's because there are already Leopards in Ukraine, which means that tank operators will have already trained on them. Most of them will have already trained on them, so no extra training is required. That'll be coming up a lot. The biggest factor in delaying the rolling out and use of various equipment is how extremely long it can take to train someone on this equipment, because modern battle tanks, modern artillery systems, modern missile systems normally take months to train on. They are extremely complicated, extremely sophisticated. A lot of them are very digitally based. Even the tanks have a lot of digital systems in them, especially Abrams tanks or, British Challenger 2 tanks. But a large number of tank operators in Ukraine already know how to use a Leopard tank. So there's almost no training there's required. Obviously, some of them will need to be trained up, but in the meantime, the experienced ones can already use them. This is also because despite being a modern, sophisticated battle tank, it's not as sophisticated as some of the other ones that are being sent over. It's more simple than, as I said, the Abrams or the Challenger 2 tank. I'll talk more about them in a sec. The US also, a couple of days after Germany announced it will be sending and allowing other countries to send Leopards, announced that it will be sending a battalion's worth, so that's about 30, that's 2 battalions worth, about 30 Abrams tanks, which is an American-made tank, probably right now the best tank in the world, period. Just not one of the best, not the best one in the West, like the best tank in the world. But the problem is, it will take a long time to get there. Before you even get to the training component, the Abrams tank is so complicated that an entire chain of infrastructure and logistics in order to supply them will need to be made across Europe. A specialist chain of parts will need to be set up to securely and secretly move across Europe, because a lot of the components for the Abrams tank are just classified, like you're not even allowed to know, even in a broad sense, how they're made. It's so secret that people don't even know what the armour that is, they've made thousands of tons of this armour. People don't even know what the armour's made of. I mean, there's secrecy, and then there's that. Like, most tanks that have been made throughout history, you might not know a lot about them, but it's pretty easy to tell what they're made of. You would have thought that secret would have came out. But the Abrams tank and also the Challenger 2 tank, which I'll be talking about in a sec, have this special type of armour called Chobham armour. It's a British-made invention, and it is the best it's the best tank armour so far that has been developed. And it was developed about 30 years ago, and that's when they really sort of like hit the nail on the head. It's kind of hard to tell when it was actually developed because it's been tweaked for a long time, but for about 30 years, it's been in widespread use, and they still managed to keep the secret of what it's actually made of. So this Chobham armour will need to be replaced, and it will need to be shipped securely and secretly so it's not robbed, damaged, or intercepted at all from America to Ukraine, which, you know, you can probably tell sounds pretty hard, and it's also probably harder than it sounds. Therefore, there is talk of actually having to build a factory in Poland to make parts just for Abram tanks so that they can be shipped straight from Poland to Ukraine, which is mental. There is a realistic chance, according to various analysts and some US government officials, there is a realistic chance that they will make a whole factory in Poland, because that will be easier than trying to ship the parts from America to Ukraine. It's crazy. Another couple of examples, aside from the Chobham armour, that make the Abrams so complicated, is it has several sophisticated computer parts, such as, you know, it has sensors all around it to check where breaches are, to check what parts of it have been damaged and how damaged they are. It has a very sophisticated network of sensors to tell the occupants everything they need to know about how the tank is doing. It also has nuclear, biological, and chemical protections. That's NBC. It's an acronym they use for nuclear, biological, and chemical protections. It's the only tank in the world that has it. Some of these preparations include filtering the air that the occupants breathe. So even if there's some sort of chemical bomb that's gone off outside, then the people inside the tank will still breathe fine, because it filters the air. It filters some biological products out of the air. I don't know which ones. Again, it's probably secret, but that is mental. It presumably filters out some radioactive material. If it's got nuclear protections, then that means that the air is probably filtered to get rid of any radioactive particles that are in the air. That's what I'd assume that means. I don't know. You didn't hear that from me. That's not actually a specific thing that I know that they do. It's all kept very secretive, but all I know is that it has nuclear, biological, and chemical protections, which is mental for a tank. But yeah, basically, they can't let the Russians get a good look at this technology. They can't let them capture the Chobham armour, or, you know, see how specifically these technologies work, maybe so they can use it themselves. They want to delay as much as possible and minimize the chances as much as possible of any of these parts in shipment or in combat getting into the wrong hands. So we've had a look at the Leopard tanks and the Abrams tank for what the mainland of Europe and America are sending broadly. But what's Britain sending? Britain is sending the British-made Challenger 2 tank. It's heavier than the Leopard and the Abrams, so obviously, you know, that complicates things. All the transport organisations and logistics need to be sorted out. They'll have pretty big spare parts, so again, it'll be a hassle trying to get them from the UK to Ukraine, so they might have to do a similar thing where they try to source them from closer countries like Poland. And the official peacetime training course for a British soldier to specialise in being a Challenger operator is 20 weeks. It's a 20-week course. That's 5 months. So Ukrainian soldiers, if this was peacetime, would be training for 5 months before they could actually use this tank. However, there are provisions for accelerated wartime training, and a lot of time training like this can get compressed up to maybe 10 weeks. It'll get halved. That's what some analysts are guessing. But what Professor Michael Clark pointed out, who's a very good analyst, he works at Sky News, he is their in-house military analyst. He's a professor of war. And what he has pointed out is that 20 weeks time frame is not only in peacetime, where there's more time to spare, but it's also for soldiers who have no experience with tanks. So a soldier who has just, you know, he's a regular guy, he's not already a tank operator, it'll take him 20 weeks to be able to to operate this tank appropriately. But If you have experienced Ukrainian tank operators taking this training, it will probably also take them less time. So it is possible that at a minimum, that training could be squashed down to 8 weeks instead of 20 weeks. Moving away from tanks, in early December, the US also agreed to supply the Patriot air defense system to Ukraine. Now, this is a very complex system, and you're probably wondering what an air defense system is. Well, it's a network of missile launchers that fire anti-air missiles, small missiles which intercept larger cruise missiles and sometimes ballistic missiles. They can also, they can intercept anything really. They can also intercept drones, but they're going to be used to intercept proper missiles, because with the cost of the anti-air missiles that the Patriot uses, it wouldn't be worth it to hit drones, especially the cheap kamikaze drones that Russia's been buying from Iran, as I talked about before. Now, I did find some documentation about the Patriot system, and it can take anywhere from 13 to 53 weeks to be trained on a Patriot missile system. A fire control operator, not sure exactly what that entails, but that I just found the name of the position. That's a 20-week training course. In fact, it varies anywhere from the launching station operator, which is the 13-week one, all the way up to a maintenance role. That maintenance role, in order to obviously maintain the system, that takes 53 weeks of official training during peacetime. However, it's been said that the Ukrainians could be given help in maintaining the systems, potentially maybe even having American soldiers come into Ukraine to help maintain the systems. That's unlikely, because obviously there are massive risks to putting any American troops on the ground in Ukraine, even if they're just there to maintain things. There may be some ways of getting around this, maybe sending civilian engineers, so it's not as much of a massive deal if one of them, somehow accidentally dies, is caught up in some sort of strike or something. Maybe if they send civilian engineers, that won't be as much of a big deal, as sad as it will be. But it's likely that the US will not send many personnel at all into Ukraine, whether they're civilians or not. So it will take quite a few months before Ukrainians are fully capable of operating the Patriot systems themselves without any outside help. However, there is a high chance that they will be able to operate them in the short to medium term before those maintenance employees are trained on them. I don't know that, but I'm just guessing that obviously maintenance, it's not crucial in the short term, and I believe that they are desperate enough and they need air defense enough that they may just train the fire control operators and the launching station operators and a few other key roles, and maybe skip out on the maintenance. Maybe, not sure. It's their decision. I can't read their minds, but I think that might happen. Additionally, again, this training will be compressed as much as it possibly can, and they'll be training with all the time they have, every second they have, every waking hour, they will be training on this to get it up and running as quick as possible, which is very different from peacetime. So again, as is sort of the default estimate, maybe this training could be cut in half to 10 weeks for a fire control operator, or 6.5 weeks for a launching station operator, which suddenly looks a lot better. The prospect looks a lot better for getting these systems in as soon as possible, which is very positive news because of the havoc that has been wreaked by the hundreds and thousands of missiles that have been fired at various cities in Ukraine over the past few months. We're coming out of the winter now, so that strategy has been struck off basically, because they know it hasn't worked, it's failed. The strategy of hitting infrastructure in the winter to just make life as miserable as possible for civilians in Ukraine, and hopefully get a surrender from either the soldiers or pressure from the civilians to make the government cede territory. It didn't work, but it did kill thousands of people, thousands of civilians, injure thousands more, and destroy so much critical infrastructure: roads, bridges, electric plants, substations, water stations, pipes supplying gas to people's homes. Those are just some of the targets that were hit. And, even though the morale has stayed high, which is shown by polling, the Ukrainian civilians did suffer massively. It did make life miserable. They did succeed in making life absolutely miserable for a large proportion of people living in that country throughout the winter, throughout that cold winter. So a competent air defense system will have the amazing use of, firstly, just ending the misery, allowing people to get on with their lives, so they're not looking to the skies all the time and thinking, their house might get blown up by a missile. People, at least in the cities where these Patriot systems will be stationed, there's 5 of them. So they've got 5 cities that can basically be perfectly protected from cruise missiles or ballistic missiles. So they'll be put in major cities near the front line, which means far, far less people will be worried about, just getting struck in a fucking missile strike while they're trying to go about their lives. It will allow life to continue. And obviously, in a more strategic sense, it's going to allow the economy to continue. They won't be having to constantly get in backup generators because the electricity's gone off for the 100th time this week. They won't need to keep replacing all their electric infrastructure, all their road infrastructure, all their rail infrastructure. The economy can start to heal in some areas. And, people can just start going on with their lives and the country can get up and running again. It also obviously protects, even on top of that, strategically significant military sites near cities. And a lot of this war is being fought over cities. Kharkiv, Kherson, Kiev. These are cities with large military presences that get hit regularly by Russia. So that will take away, in doing all those things, it will take away one of Russia's biggest advantages over Ukraine in this war. Those being, as I've mentioned before, I think, the amount of artillery they have, the number of men they have, and their capability for missile strikes. Ukraine has nowhere near as much artillery as Russia, nowhere near as much capability to send long-range missiles to the enemy, and not as many men. So you take out one of those major advantages from Russia with installing the Patriots, the missile systems. Russia have, surprisingly, even though their population is 3.2 times more than Ukraine's, Russia's population is about 144 million before the war. Ukraine's was about 43 million, I believe. Let me check that. Yes, 43 million. Even though they have that population difference, Russia has actually been losing the manpower game because of the different ways that they're fighting this war. Russia is fighting in a very old fashion, like World War I type warfare, where they're doing these long front lines and they're moving forward in one big line, just grinding forward, eroding the Ukrainian forces, losing a lot of men in the process, slowly taking land. However, the Ukrainians are fighting in a more modern way, in a more Western way, which makes sense because since 2014, since, remember Crimea? If you remember Crimea, that was annexed by Russia in 2014. Since then, Ukraine has been trained by NATO troops to fight in a more efficient Western way, where they will do quick, specific maneuvers and punch through a line and try and hit something vital to the enemy. So if that's a road or an ammo depot or try and do a quick encirclement, they'll do these short, punching, probing attacks that spare men, but still weaken the enemy and force them to move the front line back. Because if you fight over logistics and you get rid of a vital road that supplies the enemy army, then that means that if you take that out, it doesn't matter if they've got many more men than you, or even if they've got better equipment than you. If they can't supply themselves, then they need to fall back. So because Russia has been fighting this war more over lines than specific targets being punched quickly, and because of the fact that they are the offensive army, and in warfare it is a rule of form almost all the time that the offending army takes more casualties than the defending army. Furthermore, there's a lot of reasons for this, because of the various failures of the Russian army, for example, attacking initially with far too few troops, not protecting their tank columns going into Kiev during the start of the war with infantry to stop them from being attacked from above, and, just various other failings. I couldn't list them all. Ukraine has actually killed a lot more Russian soldiers than Russian soldiers have killed Ukrainian soldiers. So that's one of Russia's three advantages that is also being taken out. And even now, despite the massive Soviet stockpiles of artillery that Russia has left over, there is some evidence that Russian artillery is actually running out, or is about to run out. That's because in late autumn, around November time, there was an estimated 80% decrease in artillery shelling from May, which shows that maybe at least Russia is trying to conserve artillery. Maybe not that they're running out, but it shows that they're not just haphazardly throwing anything at it. So a lot of the aspects that Russia was winning on near the start of the war, they're starting to turn the tables. Ukraine is starting to turn the tables, and Russia is starting to lose in these aspects. There's also the S-300 old Soviet system, which a lot of soldiers have been trained on, and that may help them to get competent on the Patriot systems. It's similar to how there are a lot of Ukrainian soldiers that have been already trained on Leopard tanks, which may help them use it a bit sooner. So I crunched the numbers, I set up my estimates, I tried to give them wide margins, and these are my predictions for when various equipment will be here. The Abrams, it's very hard to tell, but somewhere between May and December. That's my prediction for when the Abrams will arrive on the battlefield in Ukraine in significant numbers. The Challenger tank should be in mid-March, anywhere up to mid-May. That's a lot sooner because the Challenger isn't quite as complex to require a whole supply line of logistics dedicated to itself, and definitely not a factory, just a whole factory to resupply the tanks. The Patriot system should be in Ukraine anywhere from late February to early June. All of these delays, which may be surprising for someone who's never studied the war before, it's all to do with training. Not so much parts or, maintenance or the red tape that's required in, shipping arms across countries. Even with the Abrams, despite how tricky it is logistically to keep them in a country, even with the Abrams, the main thing is the training. That is the main problem that Ukraine are going to have to address. How are they going to get a significant number of their men trained on these complicated systems? If they can crack that, if they can do really well at that and get them trained quickly somehow, and if the military is competent enough on that training to be trusted in a short amount of time, then, they've really got an advantage. If they can hop on them quickly in the summer, before the large summer offensives, and catch Russia off guard before they make an offensive of their own, then that will be great news, and they will take back a lot of land, trust me. So that ends my little deviation from the regular timeline into the timeline of when I predict various bits of equipment will arrive in Ukraine. Now back to the regular timeline. In March, the Russian economy will continue to decline. If the current rate of deficit keeps as it is, again, which is unlikely, it's likely to increase, but if it kept as it is, Russia's foreign exchange reserves would now be down to £95 billion, so they're almost in a deficit. And I'm also tracking month by month, in the best case scenario for Russia, that is, if the deficit was half of what it was in December every month, if they somehow find a way to claw it back, by the start of March, the foreign exchange reserves plus the former surplus would be £189 billion. There will be a slight decrease in the value of the Russian ruble because of the decline in value of exports. That's again because of the price cap. But that decrease will be moderated by the fact that, as I've said before, less and less is being imported into Russia. And the less is imported into a country compared to its exports, the stronger the currency is. So you'll have a slight decline in the ruble, which will affect its ability to buy weapons from abroad. You will also see in March that mobilised soldiers will start dying, unfortunately, because although not all of them will have been stationed yet, Russia can take as little as a few days to train their soldiers, which is really tragic, because we saw in the last mobilisation in September that although the bulk of troops arrived after 4 weeks, there were isolated reports of some troops dying less than 2 weeks after they were called up. So some of these troops literally just have days of training. So large numbers of these mobilised troops will start to die in March. There's a high chance of slight offensives in March, not these big offensives that will take time to amass, but with, the fresh soldiers coming in and their desire to attack before Ukraine has a chance to attack, there will almost definitely, probably like an 80% plus chance, there will be sort of medium scale offensives in March by Russia. These offensives will be concentrated in the middle of the Donbass, in sort of the mid-east of Ukraine. This will obviously include the area behind Bakhmut. Bakhmut is rather likely to have been conquered, or close to being conquered, at least by now. So they will have moved past it and try and push further towards the central eastern cities of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. Those are very big cities, very big as in important, because they are the last major cities in the Donbass. Towards the central eastern cities of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. They are very important cities because they are the last cities in Luhansk and Donetsk that Russia is yet to take. Once Russia takes those cities, it will be quite easy, in fact, for them to mop up the rest of the land. That's because in the countryside there will be far less infrastructure for the Ukrainian army to hold on to and far less cover. It's very hard to invade a city. To do street by street, building by building fighting, it's extremely hard for the offending side because there is just so much cover. There is so many places to hide, so many places to be shot from. So Russia is very likely to make pushes further west towards Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. They won't get there because Russian progress, just even looking at it mathematically, is orders of magnitude lower per day and per month than what it would have to be for Russia to capture Sloviansk and Kramatorsk in March. Kramatorsk is about 22 miles from the Russian front line, and I've said about the 0.15 miles a day that are being made in progress in Bakhmut. And remember, that's just in Bakhmut. Russia will not, and I repeat that confidently, will not be able to capture Kramatorsk and Sloviansk by moving the whole front line 20 miles west in March. They just won't have time. It's not going to happen. But they will try and push to get closer, to just chip away slowly at Ukraine. It's unlikely that any offensives are going to take place, medium-sized offensives that are, in Zaporizhia or in Kherson, because it would take a large number of troops and equipment to pass into Kherson city over the river, the Dnipro River, that is. Crossing a river is a very big obstacle in military exercises, as you probably know, even if you don't know anything about this stuff. It's pretty obvious. If they are going to cross the river, it will be as part of a major offensive, and they would not have the troops or the equipment for that in March. Now, it's realistic that Russia may try a slight offensive near Zaporizhia just to try and get a few extra miles north before Ukraine attempts to attack Zaporizhia. And I'll tell you in a minute why I believe they will focus on Zaporizhia, Ukraine, that is, when you get further into the spring and the summer. but Russia may attempt to inch a few miles further north just to make it a bit harder for them to attack later on. They won't get any significant gains because Zaporizhia, the city of Zaporizhia, not the region, is very close to the front line right now. And the closer they get to that city, as I've said, it's very hard to penetrate cities, and that would have to be part of a major offensive. So they couldn't get too close to the city because it provides the Ukrainians too much cover. But again, you may see a small offensive in Zaporizhia, but anything big will be in the east. That is the main focus of the military right now, the Russian military. Going conversely over to what the Ukrainians will do, what you've got to remember is even though in March they basically won't have any large number of tanks, they will have armoured vehicles, a lot of heavily armoured vehicles, hundreds in fact of heavily armoured vehicles donated by the United States, hundreds of infantry fighting vehicles, hundreds and hundreds of Humvees, and thousands of pieces of military equipment like missiles and rockets and, everything, all sorts of stuff. You can find the list online. It is literally thousands of pieces of equipment. It's a lot. It's a lot of stuff. I'm not going to attempt to get into it all or list even a fraction of it because it's a lot. So just as a medium-sized offensive from Russia is very likely in March, so is one from Ukraine, because that's when they will get a lot of this large equipment before tanks come in. And a lot of people, a lot of analysts that you'll see online or on the news are focusing so much on the tanks, but there is so much more. And if you even just skim through one of these documents released of what the West is cumulatively giving to Ukraine in these new packages for the spring, all of it, even if you take out every single tank, will still make a big difference. So they are going to use that to their advantage as soon as possible. For the Ukrainians, time is much more precious. For Russia, they kind of have inverse and opposite strategies. For Russia, the strategy is to slow things down as much as possible, to stall, to bide their time as much as possible, because the longer an army occupies an area, and this is just a conventional military wisdom now, the longer an army occupies an area, the harder it gets to kick them out, because they have time to reinforce their positions, entrench their positions, even, make fortifications if you leave them there for long enough. They have time to propagandize the public, and the public that are in that occupied area will start, it may take a long time, but eventually they will start to get used to the occupation. Something Russia is known to do, that they did in Crimea, is to non-forcefully ethnically cleanse and kind of genocide the population. Not genocide as in Holocaust, but that is technically what it is. They do technically do genocidal actions where they will kidnap the native population, a certain fraction of them, take them into mainland Russia, and incentivize Russian nationals to come in and replace them, give Russians certain benefits, or promote this new place. What Russia did with Crimea was promote it as a holiday resort, or somewhere you could set up a second home. So all these Russians started holidaying and setting up second homes and deciding to move to Crimea because it's quite sunny. They've got beaches, and millions of Russians moved there, and at least several hundred thousand, but the true numbers are unknown, Crimeans got kidnapped and sent to Russia, which is technically genocidal behavior. If you are just replacing a population, a full-on industrial, large-scale project to replace a population, Russia's known to do that. And there are reports of this already going on in the Donbass. So the longer Russia is left in these occupied areas, the more control they're going to be able to consolidate over those areas. They're going to be able to set up their own infrastructure, their own police forces, their own taxes. Ukrainian taxes are going to start going to Russia soon if they stay there long enough. If they set up tax offices in those countries, those people's taxes will be going to fund the war. So that's why it gets harder and harder the longer you leave an attacking army in an occupied area. So as soon as you can count on it, as soon as Ukraine get that equipment in March, they will also do their own medium scale counteroffensive. Their counteroffensive is likely to be in Zaporizhia. And the reason for this is because of logistics. Now, one of the main ways that Ukraine has been able to outsmart and outplay Russia throughout this war, despite their population difference, is by hitting them in the right place. As I've explained before, using the Western tactic of precise, fast, powerful hits to try and take out logistics. And Russia have just failed when it comes to supplying their troops. So how they liberated the city of Kherson was they took advantage of the fact that a lot of obstacles had to be passed by the Russian government to resupply their soldiers and keep their presence there. So if you look at this, there's two routes here. Either you cross the Kerch Bridge, this is what this is, the Kerch Bridge is very important, from mainland Russia to Crimea. There's a rail bridge there and a road bridge. So you cross this bridge, drive through Crimea, or get a train through Crimea. You cross this spit of land over to the mainland of Ukraine, and then, once you drive through much of Kherson, you then have to cross another river, the Dnieper River, to get into Kherson City. So it is a pretty tricky route just to get into that city. And remember, thousands of tons of various supplies every month will have to come into there, whether it's food for the soldiers, or petrol for the cars and vehicles, or bullets, or bombs, everything. All of that will need to be supported by this rail bridge and this road bridge, and they'll have to cross all of that. You know, that's hundreds of miles of travel away from the Russian mainland. Or they can come this way, from Western Russia, out into eastern Ukraine, through Luhansk, through that already occupied territory, down past Mariupol, past Melitopol, and then over the Dnieper River again. So this is obviously a very limited route and quite a difficult route, either of them. The second one, because it's obviously far longer, it's hundreds and hundreds of miles to resupply, until they can get their own infrastructure built inside Ukraine, which will take years, maybe decades. And the first one, because you have to cross, depending on your perspective, 2 to 3 bodies of water. The spit of land, even though it may look like Crimea is an island, it's actually just a peninsula. It is connected to mainland Ukraine by that spit of land, a few miles wide. But you could say that that's still a very narrow crossing. It's almost like a land bridge. So it's very delicate. If Ukraine can disrupt one of those points, any one of those like bottlenecks that Russia has to pass through to get to Kherson City and beyond, if Ukraine disrupts one of those like thin little bottlenecks, then Russia will not be able to resupply their forces past that point via the ground. They'd have to either fly it in or pass over the bodies of water with ships, which, I mean, even to anyone, even to people who don't know anything about stuff like this, that is obviously, you can tell that will be much harder. And most analysts I've listened to talk about this either from news channels or, just independent commentators, or actual academic experts who have been guests on news channels. From everything I've heard, they do not believe that Russia would even come close to being able to supply forces by water or air. They think that the only way that they have the capability to supply forces past the Dnieper River would be via land. So the reason I'm saying all this is because if Ukraine did push south from Zaporizhia and attempt to cut off the southwesterly, I guess you could say, forces from the eastern forces, then that would cut off Russia's probably slightly easier alternative. of coming from western mainland Russia into the east and not crossing into Crimea. If they got to the Azov Sea past Melitopol and cut off that alternative route, that would leave only one single route, and at one point one single bridge to supply the entire southerly forces, and obviously that is very, very risky. At that point, all the Ukrainian forces would need to do is drop one single bomb, one drone, one, ship carrying explosives that they've snuck in. Just one single attack, and there would be no more supply by land to Russia's southern forces. None at all. That's all it takes. If they cut off that alternative route by pushing to the sea, one column pushing to the sea from Zaporizhia, then they drop one large explosive on the Kerch Bridge, you then just disrupt the whole logistics of the front in one fell swoop. Well, two fell swoops, I guess. So that is why Ukraine's counterattack is most likely to be in Zaporizhia, whereas Russia's is most likely to be in the mid-east of Ukraine, probably in Donetsk. I'm not sure if I mentioned, but Russia's next likely location to counterattack is Kharkiv. And then after that, I'd probably say Zaporizhia to get ahead of Ukrainian forces. And then lastly behind that, I'd say one of the least likely locations they are to attack is Kiev. Ukraine probably goes, obviously, Zaporizhia, and then probably Kharkiv again to try and cut off the supply road to Russian forces in the Mideast, because a lot of them are supplied via a highway, the P66 highway. I'm sure I've talked about that before. And Ukraine is not very likely to attack with any sort of significant offensive anywhere else than that. So that was the roundup for what I predict will happen in the Ukraine-Russia war. This is all a large part of answering how it will eventually all end. This part of the timeline has been complete up until the 1st of April. The next video will continue the timeline from April through May, and if I have time, maybe through June. But yes, that'll be the state of things by the end of March. Medium-sized counteroffensives from both sides. Russia probably gaining more land in Ukraine. Ukraine having some very significant large forces supplied from the West. Russia nearing a budget deficit and the oil price cap increasing. So that's it for this analysis and presentation. Hope you enjoyed the slides. Hope you enjoyed the audio. I guess you could have just listened to this as kind of a podcast thing, but there were points where you needed to watch it. So I hope the slideshow wasn't too boring, even though I know this is a very long video. But yeah, that was it. I hope you enjoyed. Please come back to the next installment where I go through April, May, June. See you. Bye-bye. Try and have a good day.